Communal experiences and environmental elements, such as rivers, mountains, and resources, determine the behavior of nations and shape their mindsets. These conditions are especially true in the case of Japan's distinct identity. In this report, we will go over the focal points of Japanese history and explain how the country's modern geopolitical narrative took shape. Welcome to Caspian Report. My name is Shirvan. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter for additional updates. The state of Japan, or locally known as Nippon, means the origin of the sun, which reflects the geographic seclusion of the nation. As an archipelago on the outer rim of the Asian world, Japan, unlike the rest of the continent, was not subjected to foreign invasions and migrations. In fact, following the arrival of the Yamato people in 300 BC, Japan experienced no mass influx of people. The early settlers had to make do with the short supply of habitable land, since about 73% of Japan was and still is unfavorable for human habitation. As such, the Yamato settlers were confined to minor coastal plains that surrounded the islands. Furthermore, the lack of arable land meant that whoever controlled the farmlands could exercise political control over the realm. The scarcity of available resources and the mountainous terrain made internal conflicts over land rights, taxation, and supply lines inevitable. For the imperial court in Kyoto, centralization, unification, and consolidation of power in the distant provinces remained an exceedingly demanding objective. Hence, for a large portion of its history, Japan was consumed by clan-based fighting. For example, in the 9th century, feudal lords established autonomous militaries that rejected the authority of Kyoto. The warriors that filled the ranks, the samurai, were highly sought after, and so organized in various clans. Roughly 3 centuries later, the imperial army was defeated by a provincial clan. The clan ruler proclaimed himself as the shogun and subjected the imperial court. This had a profound impact on the course of history. Even though the Kyoto court held formal authority, true power, however, lay with the shogunate. For centuries, the shogun rulers deliberately isolated the country due to the decentralized status quo, internal rivalries, as well as the threat of foreign powers. This state of affairs, more or less, lasted up to the early modern age. There were, of course, brief moments when Japan looked outwards and swiftly assimilated foreign ideas and knowledge. For instance, the arrival of European merchants brought forth innovations such as modern shipbuilding, bookmaking, firearms, as well as the early modern scientific method. Yet, whenever the shogun rulers felt threatened by foreign influences, they closed off the country. So, for example, along with European innovations came Christianity and mercantilism. As both ideas spread through the land, it incited insubordination, which made the shogun vulnerable. As a result, they closed off the country, purged the Christians, and designated certain cities as trading hubs with foreigners. Thus, in basic terms, Japan's rapid revision between isolation and expansion is a consistent occurrence in its history. Eventually, in the 19th century, following the gunboat diplomacy of the Perry expedition, the United States forced Japan to open up to international trade and thereby foreign ideas and influences. The byproduct of the American confrontation resulted in the Meiji Restoration of 1868, when a group of samurai overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate and consolidated political power under the Emperor Meiji. For the first time in history, Japan was centralized under one government. The revolution was followed by a period of rapid modernization led by the military faction. Tokyo imitated the European and American experiences with industrialization and state building. Within decades, Japan transformed from an isolated feudal society to its early modern form. The government formed a modern army backed by a modern navy and sought to secure its national interests. Since the military oversaw the process of modernization, admirals and generals dominated the government in Tokyo. Subsequently, the military faction believed that in order to deter European colonialism and to assure the security of the home islands and the regional maritime trade, Japan had to secure Okinawa and Kyushu by gaining a firm stronghold in Taiwan and Korea respectively. As such, Tokyo embarked on a policy of military expansionism. In 1894, the country acquired control over the Korean peninsula. A year later, Japanese forces invaded and annexed Taiwan. The territorial advances invigorated the military government to look beyond their immediate periphery. A decade later, in 1905, Japan dealt the Russian Empire a devastating military blow and gained exclusive rights in the mineral-rich Manchuria region, as well as the southern portion of the Kuril Islands, which restricted a naval power from approaching Japan from the north. By the end of the war, Japan had fully secured its primary strategic needs. However, as modernization accelerated into industrialization, an ever-growing nationalist fervor was instilled in the Japanese society, military, and economy. To maintain the new empire, as well as the modern military and industries, Tokyo was in need of enormous quantities of raw materials such as rubber, iron, coal, and oil, most of which was absent in the home islands. Furthermore, by 1926, the population of Japan had doubled in size since the start of the modernization process. As a nation of 60 million people, the demand for resources outpaced Japan's domestic output. The military government in Tokyo realized that without new sources of raw materials, the acquisition of Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria could not be assured as the country was headed towards an economic meltdown. Thus, the only way to sustain the empire was to expand and exploit the rest of Asia. To that end, in the 1930s, Japanese military forces invaded China's Manchuria region and proclaimed a puppet government in the area. These events enabled the Japanese industries to exploit the mineral-rich territories of Manchuria. Years later, in 1937, tensions between China and Japan deteriorated sharply, and a full war between the two powers broke out. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, the American leadership grew increasingly anxious about a resurgent Japan. As such, Washington gave Tokyo an ultimatum to abandon its territorial gains or face an oil embargo. At the time, roughly 80% of Japan's oil was imported from the United States. The American ultimatum left the Japanese with little choice. They could either give up their new empire or expand and exploit the oil-rich territories of Dutch-controlled Indonesia. The latter option meant waging war against the United States. What happened next is part of well-known history. Japan took a risk and lost, but a series of events displays that the country was attracted to the mainland of Asia due to its fears of foreign hegemony as well as the need for resources. Moreover, it shows that the Japanese geopolitics is prone to dramatic change if its resources, and thereby its security, is ever threatened. The American victory over Japan stripped the country of its sovereignty and imposed a constitutional restriction that prohibited the maintenance of a military. This concession was more symbolic than practical, since Japan basically renamed its military as the Self-Defense Forces. Yet, what allowed the country to truly capitulate is the fact that Washington provided for Tokyo's security needs. For one, the American Navy assured the security of Japan's maritime traffic. This was followed by a large US military presence in Okinawa, while Taiwan and South Korea were incorporated in a regional coalition with Japan. These developments secured Japan's vulnerabilities in the Kyushu and Ryukyu Islands. Furthermore, Washington lent support to counter the growing influence of Moscow. During the Cold War, industrial conglomerates protectionist policies, and access to high-end technology, as well as the military needs during the Korean War, rehabilitated Japan's finances. The government depreciated its currency to promote exports and to assure domestic investment. Tokyo also used the life savings of Japanese citizens to reinvest in the services sector. Although the state-planned economic model would later on backfire, initially it helped to revive the economy. As Japan's revival accelerated, the country once again developed a growing need for raw materials and resources. This time, however, Tokyo provided subsidized loans to Japanese multinational firms with the task of forging trading and manufacturing bonds with nations abroad. Between 1960 and 1967, the economy doubled in size and continued to surge until the 1980s. The abundance of wealth stimulated Japanese banks towards a lending spree. Multinational companies with close ties to the government invested fiercely in the strategic resources, labor forces, and supply markets that were essential to Japan's manufacturing industries. It was essentially mercantilism reinvented, and it worked. Then, in the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Japan's economic miracle came to a sudden stop. Washington no longer cared to tolerate Tokyo's protectionist regulations. As the United States changed its financial attitude towards Japan, the latter was forced to let its state-planned economy open up to the world. However, Japan was simply ill-prepared for free market capitalism. As soon as the protectionist policies were lifted, the national currency inflated, the real estate bubble crashed, and national banks failed. The government responded by designing enormous public-funded stimulus packages, which helped to restore the economy. However, as soon as the packages were removed, the country dipped into a recession once again. In the meantime, public debt vastly expanded, bond issues skyrocketed, and budget deficits grew. This pattern of recessions has endured to this day. Decades of stimulus packages and quantum easing has brought the debt to GDP ratio to at least 230%, which is by far the highest debt ratio of any major nation, surpassing even Greece, which sits at roughly 180%. The truth is, if nothing changes, sustaining the prosperity of Japan will be increasingly difficult in the long term. The fact is that more and more nations favor production over consumption. As such, the global economy is injected with more commodities than it can absorb. As a result, prices of goods have continued to decline. However, as China reforms its economy, Japan in the long term will have to increasingly produce more just to maintain a neutral balance. This will be especially hard to accomplish given Japan's demographic crisis and addiction to quantum easing, as well as the public debts and the industrial lobbies. Ultimately, Japan altered between periods of isolationism to military expansionism to neo-mercantilism. The final and latter policy is driven by the country's reliance on the American Navy to safeguard the maritime traffic. This implies that Washington indirectly determines the well-being of Tokyo. Thus, to assure American assistance, Tokyo must seek for ways to shape the behavior of Washington. However, in recent years, the United States has reduced its commitments in East Asia, while Japan has relaxed its constitutional restrictions on the military. These measures imply that as Washington withdraws from the region, Japan is slowly preparing for ways to secure the coming power vacuum. This was a Caspian Report by me, Shirvan. If you are not yet subscribed to our channel, now would be a great time to do so. Also, special thanks to our amazing contributors on Patreon who made this report possible. We have a lot more interesting content coming, and you can help our work through our crowdfunding platform on patreon.com/CaspianReport, but if you cannot afford to, then don't. You could help us instead by sharing your favorite Caspian Report videos on Facebook or Twitter. In any case, thank you for your time, and Sahol.